Well, welcome back to our tactics training. I'm Greg Hochul from Stand to Reason. This is our fifth time together. And what we covered up to this session is we've talked about the entire game plan, the Columbo tactic, using questions to maneuver in conversations. We also talked about one way to use questions is to exploit a weakness or a flaw. And so last time around, we looked at a particular tactic called the suicide tactic that can be used in that way. We talked about suicidal views express contradictory concepts, therefore they kind of self-destruct. They aren't things that you have to work too hard on. You just have to recognize it and point it out, okay? We also talked about how you recognize when someone's point of view does self-destruct. You identify the basic premise or the basic conviction or claim, and that's not always obvious, so spend some time reflecting on it. Next, you ask, does the claim apply to itself? Okay, and if it does apply to itself, does it refute itself? And if it does, then you find a way to demonstrate that by using a question to point it out. The third thing we did last time around is we took some popular examples of self-refuting claims. We played them out a little bit. They were experiences that I've had in conversations with other people. And then at the end, we talked about a specific species of suicide that I call sibling rivalry suicide. And simply put, this is where a pair of objections are in conflict with each other. And at least one of them's got to go. And if you can demonstrate the conflict, the rivalry between these siblings, then the person that you're talking with might let one go, and it makes your job a lot easier. Now, here's what I'd like to do today. I want to tell you about the very first tactic that I ever learned. It's called taking the roof off. And I didn't know about tactics at the time, but it's something I learned from the late Francis Schaeffer, who used it to great effect. What I'm going to do this session is show you what taking the roof off is. I'll show you how to recognize the circumstances where you can use this tactic. I'll talk a little bit about why this tactic works, and there's a very particular reason for it. And finally, I'm going to give you some specific examples of popular ideas that will basically lead you over a cliff if you follow them, and that's kind of the idea here. And then I'll show you how you can take the roof off with them. It's very flexible, and it's something I think that you'll find useful in your arsenal of tactics. Now, sometimes when you press a view to its logical conclusions, the results turn out to be kind of absurd. You might think of when Jesus was talking with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees told Jesus, "You're casting out demons by the ruler of demons." So what did Jesus do when he was confronted with that challenge? He said this. He said, that would mean that Satan is casting out Satan, right? And Satan would be working against himself. And a house divided against itself couldn't stand. And therefore, this was implicit. Therefore, he was not casting out demons by the power of Satan, but by the hand of God. So he looked at their point of view and their argument, and he showed how it led to an absurd consequence. He was taking the roof off, basically. And that's what you're doing when you use this tactic. You're reducing a person's point of view to its most basic level. You want to simplify it, at least so it's clear in your own mind. All right. And this is a step that I've mentioned a number of times before with all of these tactics. Many times the issue is clouded by a bunch of language. And you have to pay attention, use your Columbo questions if necessary, to figure out exactly what the claim is. Once you've got the claim in view, then you can use other tactics to determine whether it commits suicide, like we talked about last time, or whether it leads to an absurd result, giving you an opportunity to take the roof off, okay? And what we're going to do is you do that analysis, you figure out what the main thing is, and then mentally you kind of give it a test drive. You think, well, look, if we accept that as true and we keep moving forward with it, does it take us to any absurd places? So for the sake of argument, we're going to treat it as if it were true. Then we're going to test drive it and see if, following the logical consequences, the route leads you over a cliff. And if it does, there's probably something wrong with where you started in the first place, okay? So that's the basic idea here. Now, the point of this tactic is to see if a person can really live with the moral or intellectual consequences of his beliefs, because they can be applied in different ways. And in essence, what you're doing is you're taking their moral or rational views seriously, and then you're showing them that if they're applied consistently, they're going to lead to something that's either absurd for an intellectual issue or for a moral issue, just clearly immoral, okay? That's taking the roof off. The tactic is also known as reductio ad absurdum, or simply reductio to make it short. That is, you're taking the point of view and you are reducing it to its absurd conclusion or consequence. What this shows, though, is that some points of view that people hold simply prove too much if you take them seriously. You remember in the very first session, I talked to you about the witch in Wisconsin. And in my series of questions there, when she said that abortion, baby killing is appropriate in the case of incest, I asked her a question that stopped her in her tracks. Do you remember what that question was? Yeah, I asked her, if I had a 2-year-old that was standing next to me who had been conceived by incest, then on your view, I should be allowed to kill this baby. Is that right? There is my application. I took her point of view. I gave it a test drive. I saw where it landed. This is disastrous. It would lead to infanticide, affirming infanticide. And so then I just used questions to kind of make that point with her. At that particular point, I was using the taking the roof off tactic with the witch in Wisconsin. All right, let me explain why this tactic is so powerful. Francis Schaeffer, who developed this tactic and gave it its name, taking the roof off, observed something about the human condition. He said, look, given that Christianity is actually true, that means that every human being really is made in the image of God. Every human being must live in the world that God created. And it turns out if that person denies God or denies anything about the truth about God and his world, essentially anything about the Christian worldview, then he's denying reality in some sense. And there's something we know about reality. The real world that we live in, if you don't take it seriously, it has a way of getting your attention. You run into it. You have a collision with it. It may injure you if you don't take it seriously. Well, take that step just a little further. If you are denying some fact of reality, some fact of the Christian worldview, then your belief, contrary to the Christian worldview, is a denial of reality, and there's going to be a collision between what the false worldview dictates and the way the world actually is, okay? Now, Francis Schaeffer called this the point of tension. Now, last session, I mentioned something about Richard Dawkins and how on the one hand, he's a relativist. He doesn't believe in objective morality because he's a naturalist, a materialist. He's an atheist. He understands that if there is no God, then there can't be any morality. But then at the same time, he's attacking the God of the Bible in one of his books as being wicked and immoral. Now, you can't have both things. This is a sibling rivalry we talked about. But why is it that he makes this mistake? He makes this mistake because on the one hand, he's a rebel against God, and he wants to say the things consistent with his rebellious worldview. But on the other hand, he's a human being who lives in God's world, and God's world is absolutely thick with morality. And so he can't keep himself from making moral judgments, which he ends up making against God, and which I don't think apply to God properly. He's mistaken in that regard, but he is not mistaken in making moral judgments because that's part of the real world that we live in. Now, what happens with non-believers who do this kind of thing is they've kind of erected a protective roof over themselves. The roof protects them from the tension, from the consequences of their own idea, because Richard Dawkins would have to look at something like gay bashing, which he thinks is terrible, and I do as well, and he'd have to say that there's no moral content to that at all. So he just avoids looking at that natural consequence of his view, and that's the roof that protects him, okay? Our job, Francis Schaeffer said, is to take the roof off. And we do it in a gracious way but we try to make that person face the consequences of his own view. Now, I mentioned Richard Dawkins, the atheist, because atheism, I think, has lots of these kinds of examples in it, these kinds of collisions with reality. And what you'll notice, by the way, with atheists is when they collide with reality, that is, they run into something in the real world that doesn't fit their worldview, they just call it an illusion. So morality is an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion. Design is an illusion. These are the kind of things they say because they are denying those things that will not fit in the box of their worldview. So what happens if you have a moral relativist? Someone says there is no objective morality. So how do we take the roof off on a person like that? I heard one person suggest steal the stereo. Says there's no morality? All right, steal a stereo. What's his complaint going to be? You did something wrong? Stealing is wrong? You can't say that. So what we're doing in that simple act, and now I'm not telling you to steal anything, but you see the contrast, you see the conflict. In that simple attempt or that simple act, you are demonstrating that the person doesn't really believe what he says he believes. No, they want to talk about relativism when it's convenient for them, but in the real world, in day-to-day interactions, they're moral realists. They believe in objective morality, and their reactions are going to show that. And what you want to do is, given that we know that deep down inside they believe in moral reality, that they're human beings made in the image of God and they must live in God's world, we're going to try to construct some kind of situation that forces them to face the facts. That's how you take the roof off. And if you can use questions in the process, all the better. What about, let's say, naturalistic Darwinian evolution? So this is part of the atheist package. Now, I think Darwinian evolution fails on the merits, but there are other problems with it. And that is, if Darwinism is true, then put simply, the only rule that matters in the world is that the strong rule the weak. Not that the strong should care for the weak. That's a moral principle. There are no moral principles, no objective moral principles in evolution. And there is just this principle of the strong ruling the weak. So if a person is holding to Darwinism, then I think it's fair to ask this question. So here comes Columbo. Tell me your principled objection to genocide. Joseph Stalin? Mao Zedong? I mean, between the two of them, we've got pretty close to 100 million lives taken. So much for the old canard that it's religion that causes most bloodshed in the world. No, it isn't. It's secular ideologies. For example, communism, which has atheism as its foundation. And they believe in the Darwinian model. And the Darwinian model says the strong rule the weak. And that's what they're doing. They're the strong ones. They're ruling the weak ones. Who's to complain? Now, I know that atheists don't think that's right. My question is, what is their principled argument against it, given their worldview? And the answer is, there is no principled argument against it, given their worldview. What have I done? I've taken the roof off and I've let the cold wind blow. So they have to feel the force of the consequence of their worldview. They know that in the real world, there's terrible evil. They don't want to admit it quite like that in so many words, especially when they're defending turf. And when they're advancing atheism, they're going to deny objective morality, okay? You take the roof off in that situation. Sam Harris is another new atheist. And Sam Harris, this is really amazing to me. But he's not alone in this. Sam Harris is a determinist. And what a determinist is a person who believes that the whole world, the whole universe, every single thing is just a complicated set of dominoes falling. All of the choices we make, all the things that we believe, are all determined by the physical circumstances that come before him. Now, why does he believe this? Because he's an atheistic naturalist. He believes in the material world. There can't be anything like free will because you cannot get free will from a materialistic world. So at this particular point, Sam Harris is consistent with his worldview. But you take it a little further, and you're going to have some real problems. For example, if determinism is true, you can't have any morality. You can't have people that are praised for good things they do or blamed for bad things that they do, because praise and blame don't work in a world where there is no good or bad. Everything's already determined by the circumstances that come before, so there are no choices to be made. So how is it that Sam Harris then can talk about morality? Worse, how can he even argue in favor of atheism or Darwinism or even determinism? Because to argue in favor of something presumes that you have the freedom of choice to assess the argument and come to a conclusion based on the evidence. But if determinism is true, you don't come to any conclusions. You just believe what you're determined to believe because of the physical circumstances before you. That is, Sam Harris has a couple of different points of view that cannot coexist. And this is another example of sibling rivalry. And we take the roof off and we show them, your worldview can only give you these goods and no more. And if that is a little painful, sorry about that. Now, if you want this other stuff, if you want morality, if you want free will, if you want rationality, there's the only place you're going to get that is from our worldview, not from yours. And what you've been doing is you've been living on borrowed capital, basically. You've been stealing from us. So you take the roof off and show them where their worldview leads. Remember, you take their point of view seriously for the sake of argument, you give it a test drive mentally, you see where it leads, and then you just point that out. And if you can use questions to do so, all the better. I had a conversation on the radio once with somebody called in about the issue of homosexuality. Actually, he was gay himself. And as he's trying to justify his own point of view, he said, well, I was born that way. Okay, now you've heard this before. Let me just tell you, as an aside, no one was born that way. There's not a shred of evidence for this. And everybody in the business, in the scientific business of assessing this question, knows it. There's no debate about this. And the twin studies have proved this conclusively, okay? Even people who are gay or gay-friendly who are doing the research, they all acknowledge that there is no physical basis, no genetic basis for homosexuality. They all know this. You'll never hear this on CNN, but this is a fact, okay? Still, people will say, I was born that way, okay? And there's a principle in play here. The principle, the unspoken principle is, if I was born that way, then it's natural to me. And if it's natural to me, then it must be okay for me. All right. Now that's the part you have to kind of strain out of the statement. You have to break it down to its component parts in your own mind. Okay, this is where he's going to. Now, does this conclusion that is implicit in the I was born that way defense of homosexuality, the conclusion that anything that's natural is moral, does that lead to any bizarre consequences? And the answer is yes, it does. And in fact, I use that on him. I said, let me tell you something. What I want to know is, how would you respond if I said this to you? Now I said to him, I don't believe this, but how would you respond if I said it to you? If I said I had a condition that I've had all my life, ever since I was a younger child, I was aware of this, and now I'm using the language that was perfectly parallel with his own description of his developing same-sex attraction. But then I tell him what my natural impulse actually is. I have a natural impulse to beat up homosexuals when I meet them. So what think you? What say you about that? Apparently he didn't hear the part where I said, I don't believe that. And so he got really mad at me. And I said, look at, Marty was his name. I'm not advancing that view. What I want to know is, what is your objection to my view in light of what you told me was a defense for your own view? That's all I'm asking. So what am I doing? I'm taking the roof off. I'm showing, if this is your morality, that just doing what comes naturally is therefore moral, then any kind of vice that I can claim is natural for me turns out not to be a vice at all, even something like gay bashing. That's a problem. Okay. Actually, when you think about it, the difference between just doing what comes naturally and principled self-restraint is called civilization, okay? Animals do what comes naturally. Human beings, by contrast, are supposed to take their behaviors captive, if you will, to moral realities. We don't do our natural impulses. We say no to them because a lot of them are vices, not virtues. And therefore, this cannot be a good defense for homosexuality, okay? We learned that by taking the roof off. A number of years ago in the state of California, there was a criminal that was going to be executed, and Mother Teresa, when she was still alive, of course, contacted the governor of the state of California and was trying to get the prisoner's sentence commuted. And here is her logic. She said Jesus would forgive. Now, would Jesus forgive? Well, yeah, if the person is repentant and turns to Christ for forgiveness, yeah, Jesus would forgive even a gross murderer. But is this a good argument for the governor to commute the sentence? And the answer is no, and because the rationale or point of view proves too much. So what is the point of view? The point of view is that wherever Jesus would forgive, we should not punish. Okay? But what would Jesus forgive? He'd forgive everything if we ask for forgiveness. So this becomes an argument not against capital punishment, but an argument against all punishment of any kind. Again, it proves too much. Now, I think that God has his court and man has his court, and the court that man has is one that God has given to him. And therefore, God can do what he wants in his court, but man has to do what is appropriate in that court environment. And forgiving every criminal is not appropriate, even though Jesus would do it. How do we know it's not appropriate? Because we take the roof off. And following that rule would mean we'd have to end the prison system entirely, okay? Now, how about the person who says, well, I'm not hurting somebody? Okay, a lot of times in moral issues, you'll be talking about these things, trying to make a case about something, and they'll say, well, I'm not hurting anybody, so therefore my morality is okay. That's the implicit conclusion, all right? I remember having a conversation at a wedding, and we were all at a dinner table, and there was an attorney sitting across from me, a young lady who is not a Christian, and this point came up. And I said to you, so you must have been really upset when they prosecuted that doctor who molested that woman while she was under sedation. And she said, no, I thought that was terrible. And I said, well, wait a minute. He wasn't hurting anyone. So in that situation, her moral rule was fulfilled, but it was obvious that this person was doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. Think of a peeping Tom, for goodness sake. Why is that illegal? They're not hurting anybody. And in fact, people who are being peeped on don't even know they've been peeped on much of the time. So where's the harm in that? Well, it turns out, just by reflecting on those illustrations as I take the roof off, this would be the consequence, that morality has got to be much broader than simply the rule, do no harm, as long as I'm not hurting someone. No, there's a lot more to morality than that. And therefore, simply arguing that I'm not hurting anybody is not enough justification to be able to allow you to do whatever it is you want to do. Okay? In the real world, morality is much bigger than this kind of thing. All right? That's the point of tension, by the way. The person wants to limit morality to this particular thing because it's comfortable for them and maybe justifies their own views, but at the same time, they have to live in God's world. And there are plenty of counterexamples that are clearly wrong to them that do not fall under that heading as long as I'm not hurting someone. We talked about another example in another session when a student says there is no truth, and we talked about that being self-refuting. You could ask them, really, is that true? But you could also ask another question that would be an example of taking the roof off. This idea that there is no truth, almost universally in my experience, comes from students. So when they go to college, this is what they learn. They learn there is no truth. And that strikes me as a little bit odd. Isn't going to the university the place where you're supposed to learn what is true and gain knowledge, whatever? So if that's what they're learning, what are they doing at the university? And that's what I ask. If you don't believe there's truth, then what are you doing here at the university? Is this what your professors are teaching you? There's no truth? You should ask for your money back. The fact is, in the real world, there is truth and we can know it. Indeed, we are truth seekers by nature. This is the way we're made. We're made in the image of God. We live in the world that God has made. And deep down inside, people know these things to be so, these things that they're trying to deny for other reasons. What we do is we take their point of view, we give it a test drive, and we see where it leads. That's taking the roof off. So that's what we've done so far in this session. We learned the basic tactic, taking the roof off. We learned the 3 steps that you need to take in order to use the tactic. You reduce the point of view to its basic premise, and then you adopt it as true for the sake of discussion. Let's say you're right about that, okay? If you're right about that, then where does it go? And then we reflect on where it goes. And if it turns out, when we give it a test drive, when we force the person to face the logical consequences of their view, if it turns out to take you over a cliff, if it turns out to be absurd or obviously immoral in the case of moral issues, then we know that the starting place is probably a bad starting place. And we want them to consider maybe adopting a new starting place. Something must be wrong with the view that you began with that leads to this end. That's the reductio ad absurdum. That's taking the roof off. We also learn why this tactic works, and I've mentioned it many times to reinforce the notion. It works because God actually exists. Human beings live in the world that God made. They're made in the image of God, and they cannot get away from that. And every person who denies any of those facts or any facts related to that are going to have to live in a way that contradicts some aspect of reality. And that's the tension. The way they believe the world is and the way the world actually is, that's the point of tension. Schaeffer talked about that we can, if we're watching for it, we can exploit it. And people have tried to protect themselves by erecting a kind of roof to protect them from their self-deception, to shield them from the logical implications of their beliefs, and they're not willing to follow those out. Okay, well, this is what we do. Gently but firmly, we take the roof off, we try to deprive them of their false sense of security, and we show them where their view actually leads, okay? And we always use what? Questions whenever we can. So here's your homework. I want you to be alert this week to points of view that might lead to absurd conclusions if they're practiced consistently. And again, take the other person's point of view, reduce it to its basic premise, give it a mental test drive, see where it might go. And maybe you'll find out that it leads them over a cliff or into a ditch. Then you come back and you take the roof off and you help them to see the consequences of their own viewpoint. And when you do this, by the way, next week, I think it'd be great if you're part of a group right now that you share that with the group. So be in the habit of interacting about some of these things you're learning and how you're putting them into play. It will really help your learning. Now, in the very next session, which will be our last session, I'm going to teach you one more technique, one more tactic. And it's actually an important defensive tactic. That is, it's a tactic that you use in defense of what somebody else is doing. I call this tactic steamroller. You'll learn why I call it that, obvious reasons. We'll deal with that next week when we talk about steamroller. See you then.